Imagine living in a world where a single failed harvest could mean the death of thousands. Where the difference between survival and starvation wasn't determined by individual effort, but by a collective decision made generations before you were born. Around 5,000 years ago, in the flat river plains of southern Mesopotamia, early human communities faced this reality every season. They developed a survival rule so effective that it sustained millions of people across centuries. It wasn't a law written in stone. It wasn't enforced by armies. It was a system, a way of organizing food so that no one harvest could destroy an entire population. But survival rules only work when people follow them. And when the pressures change, when power shifts, even the most successful systems can unravel. This is the story of how the ancient Sumerians built one of history's first large-scale famine prevention systems, and what happened when it stopped working. Southern Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, was not an easy place to live. The region that would become Sumer had no mountains to trap rainfall, no forests to stabilize the soil, and no natural barriers to protect against invaders. What it did have was flat, fertile land, fed by two unpredictable rivers. The rivers flooded. But unlike the Nile in Egypt, which flooded predictably every year, the Tigris and Euphrates were erratic. Some years, the floods came early and destroyed planted crops. Other years, they came late or not at all, leaving fields dry and populations desperate. The floods could also be violent, sweeping away entire settlements in a matter of hours. The people who settled here around 5000 BCE understood this risk. They were early agriculturalists, experimenting with barley and wheat, learning to irrigate fields using canal systems. But irrigation brought its own problems. In the intense heat of the Mesopotamian summer, water evaporated quickly, leaving salt deposits in the soil. Over time, this salinization reduced crop yields, making the land less productive even when water was available, so the environment itself was a test. A community could plant, irrigate, and harvest successfully for several years, and then lose everything in a single bad season. Without a way to store surplus food, without a buffer against environmental shocks, survival was fragile. Families couldn't stockpile enough grain on their own to last through multiple failed harvests. Individual storage was vulnerable to pests, rot, and theft. The question wasn't whether bad years would come. The question was whether human organization could outlast them. The solution that emerged wasn't invented overnight. It developed gradually, over centuries, as communities grew larger and more complex. By the Uruk period, roughly 4000 to 3100 BCE, the Sumerians had begun constructing centralized grain storage facilities, communal granaries that were larger, more secure, and more durable than anything a single household could build. These weren't just bigger barns. They were architectural statements. Excavations at sites like Uruk and Eridu reveal massive mud brick structures with thick walls, elevated floors, and ventilation systems designed to keep grain dry and cool. Some granaries were built with multiple chambers, allowing administrators to separate different types of grain or to isolate stores from different harvests. The goal was preservation, keeping food edible for years, not just months. The granaries were usually located near temple complexes. This wasn't accidental. Temples in Sumerian cities weren't purely religious institutions. They were administrative centers, economic hubs, and sites of record-keeping. Priests and temple officials managed the collection, storage, and distribution of grain. They developed early forms of accounting, using clay tokens and later cuneiform tablets to track how much grain came in, how much was distributed, and how much remained in reserve. This system was fundamentally communal. Farmers contributed portions of their harvest to the central granary, not as a tax in the modern sense, but as a form of collective insurance. In good years, the granary filled. In bad years, the stored grain was distributed back to the population, preventing mass starvation. The logic was simple. Individual families couldn't survive repeated crop failures on their own, but a city-state with centralized reserves could. By pooling resources, the community transformed unpredictable environmental risk into manageable scarcity. Not everyone would eat well in a famine, but most people would survive. By the early dynastic period, roughly 2900 to 2350 BCE, this system had become the norm across Sumerian city-states. Cities like Ur, Lagash, and Nippur each maintained their own granaries, managed by temple bureaucracies that employed scribes, laborers, and overseers. Archaeological evidence suggests these facilities could store enough grain to feed thousands of people for multiple years. The results were measurable. Population densities in Sumerian cities were among the highest in the ancient world. Urban centers grew to tens of thousands of inhabitants, numbers that would have been impossible without reliable food security. The granary system didn't eliminate hunger, but it eliminated the worst-case scenario: total societal collapse from a single environmental shock. This was the survival rule. Store collectively. Distribute strategically. Survive as a community, not as individuals. But systems designed to solve one problem often create new ones. As Sumerian cities grew larger and more prosperous, the granary system became more complex and more vulnerable to human decision-making. By the mid-3rd millennium BCE, the administrative class had expanded significantly. Temple bureaucracies now included not only priests, but accountants, overseers, laborers, and military officials. The granaries were no longer just storage facilities. They had become economic power centers. Because control over grain meant control over survival. This shift did not happen suddenly. There was no single moment when the system changed. But gradually, access to stored grain became more restricted. What had once functioned as a communal safety net began to resemble a state-controlled asset. Rations were still distributed during shortages, but the process became less transparent. Temple elites and city rulers now decide who received grain, how much, and when. Cuneiform records from this period reveal growing social stratification. Ration lists still exist, but the quantities vary sharply by status. High-ranking officials, priests, and soldiers received larger shares. Laborers and farmers, the people who produced the grain, often received just enough to survive. This shift was not always driven by cruelty. It may have reflected attempts to maintain order, reward loyalty, or preserve critical skills. But it introduced a new vulnerability. The system had been designed to protect everyone from environmental shocks. Now it was being used to manage social hierarchy. Other pressures compounded the problem. Urban populations had grown so large that even successful harvests sometimes fell short of demand. Irrigation systems, once an advantage, were degrading the soil through salinization. Crop yields declined. At the same time, political instability increased. City-states competed for water, land, and trade routes. Military campaigns required grain to feed soldiers. Each conflict reduced civilian reserves. The system was still functioning, but it was no longer functioning as intended. The survival rule was being reinterpreted. And under pressure, reinterpretation leads to selective enforcement. Around 2200 BCE, the environmental conditions that had always threatened Mesopotamia returned with force. A prolonged drought struck the region, lasting for decades. Rivers shrank. Irrigation canals dried up. Harvests failed repeatedly across multiple city-states. This was the kind of crisis the granary system had been built to survive. But this time, the system couldn't absorb the shock. The problem wasn't that the granaries were empty, at least not immediately. The problem was that access to grain had become a political decision. When scarcity hit, those with power protected themselves first. Elite families, military units, and temple officials continued to receive rations. Farmers, laborers, and the urban poor did not. Cuneiform records from this period are sparse, but the ones that survive tell a consistent story. Texts describe food riots, abandoned fields, and mass migrations. People left cities in search of better conditions, moving north toward regions with more reliable rainfall, or west toward the Mediterranean coast. Urban populations collapsed not because everyone died, but because survival meant leaving. Some city-states tried to adapt. Rulers opened emergency reserves, reduced rations for elites, or imposed strict rationing across all social classes. But these measures came too late. Trust in the system had already eroded. People who had contributed grain to communal storage for generations no longer believed they would receive help when they needed it. And without that trust, the entire logic of collective survival broke down. This is the part that's often misunderstood. The collapse of Sumerian city-states wasn't caused solely by drought. Droughts had happened before. The collapse happened because the survival rule, the one that had worked for centuries, was no longer being followed. Selective survival replaced collective survival, and once that shift occurred, the system couldn't recover. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Excavations show that many Sumerian cities were gradually abandoned rather than destroyed. There are no widespread signs of violent conquest or sudden catastrophe. Instead, there's slow depopulation, deteriorating infrastructure, and eventually, silence. The granaries themselves remained standing for decades, even centuries, after the populations they were meant to feed had dispersed. They became monuments to a system that had worked until it didn't. The decline of Sumerian civilization didn't end Mesopotamia. New powers rose: Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, each inheriting and adapting elements of Sumerian technology, administration, and culture. But the specific system that had sustained millions of people through environmental uncertainty was never fully restored in the same form. Later Mesopotamian empires maintained granaries, but they functioned more as imperial resources than communal safety nets. Food storage became a tool of state power, used to feed armies, reward loyalty, and control populations. The principle of collective survival, where everyone contributed and everyone benefited, faded into a more hierarchical model. This wasn't unique to Mesopotamia. Similar patterns appear in other ancient civilizations. Systems designed to protect entire populations against existential risks often evolve into systems that protect elites first. The logic changes slowly, almost invisibly, until the original purpose is no longer recognizable. What's striking about the Sumerian case is how long the system worked. For over 1,000 years, centralized grain storage prevented large-scale famines, stabilized populations, and enabled the growth of some of history's first great cities. The system didn't fail because it was poorly designed. It failed because human behavior changed faster than the environment did. The droughts of the late 3rd millennium BCE were severe, but they were survivable if the collective rule had held. Instead, the rule was bent, then broken, and the result was not sudden catastrophe but slow, irreversible decline. The story of Sumerian granaries isn't a lesson with a clear moral. It's a case study in how survival systems work and stop working under pressure. The rule was simple: store collectively, distribute strategically, survive together. For centuries, it worked. Then it didn't. Not because the environment became impossible, but because the decision-makers changed the terms. And once those terms changed, the system designed to protect everyone protected no one. We know what the Sumerians built. We know what they lost. What we don't know, what archaeology can't fully answer, is whether they understood, in those final decades, what was happening.